You can't protect the people in your life simultaneously while you are honoring your pain. Period. Mic drop. I said it here first, okay? It's like you can't do that.
The one, the only, the amazing, the wonderful Vienna Pharaon, who has become a very good friend of mine, which I feel fortunate enough to say. Welcome to Been There, Felt That, a podcast where we're going to kind of go a little bit all over the place, but really what I think makes this conversation special is we bring on people like you who are these amazing teachers and healers in the world. And we spend so much time, and by we, I mean the royal we, you spend so much time in other people's stories that we really want to get to yours. So thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. That's quite the introduction. I should have a podcast with you every morning.
Yeah.
It's a good way to start off.
I'm going to send you voice notes. So we're a feelings podcast. I like feelings. I'm always in my feels. How are you feeling right now in this moment today?
Little tired. We had an early wake up this morning.
Shout out.
But I have been, shout out to Code. Thank you, buddy. But honestly, I've been in a lot of the playfulness of motherhood and parenthood. And it's been a really nice experience feeling to come back into contact with. I was saying to some of the therapists who work at Mindful, we have weekly meetings, and I was talking about how the contrast of, having had a childhood that was mostly filled with a lot of chaos and conflict and fighting and disruption and, all of the things that I, share about in the book. And to see Code having a different experience and to also get to meet him in that too. I think a lot of my play was probably disrupted, and that part feels really cool as an adult to get to drop into that childlike playfulness. It's like, he's so funny and he has such a personality. He just turned 2 a couple weeks ago. And it's like, he just invites you, like truly grabs your hand and pulls you into the space of play. And yeah, I've just been loving watching him in it, but also getting to partake and participate in it as a parent, but to also just let the little girl in me get to experience it a bit too.
That is remarkably beautiful and touching. And I'll reflect to you as somebody who has known you for the last couple years and has, watched you come into motherhood. I've noticed a shift in your energy as you have assumed this role. I have noticed as an external party what you're talking about right now. And I don't know that I ever put my finger on it, but hearing you say that, I'm like, oh, wow, that makes sense. I do feel a playfulness or a piece of you that maybe has become more exaggerated or highlighted. And it's been really beautiful. And so I love to hear your experience of that. And it feels like a lot of people I'm talking to are all entering parenthood or have recently entered parenthood. And so it's really beautiful to see this shift, because I think there's not many things when you are doing the work. I think there's not many things that shake it up like, the journey of parenthood. I know you've talked about this, a decent amount, but let's go back a little. I mean, you have a significant relationship in your life that catapulted you into your work. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship?
You're speaking to my family, or are you speaking to a specific story?
Yeah, I mean, from what I know about you, your parents separating when you were young, and this sort of chaotic nature of your household. If there's something else that feels significant, though, please share.
Yeah, so a bit of the backstory is that when I was in first grade, my parents entered into separation, divorce process that took 9 years to complete. And it was a very chaotic and, like conflictual space to be a part of, highly conflictual. There's a lot of psychological abuse, manipulation, gaslighting, extreme paranoia, emotional flooding. And I am an only child, so this tiny little human in the family system, watching everything go down. And I didn't have siblings to, connect with, or, have any of my experience really validated. And neither of my parents remarried or repartnered ever. So there were never any other adults in the system either to, pull me aside or, connect with. And so I was in this very chaotic system that was crashing and burning around me. And as a little tiny human, I decided somewhere along the way that I would kind of fly under the radar and present as if I was fine and unaffected and unbothered by the things that were going on. And I saw them as two adults who were not okay. And so I felt like there wasn't space for me to also not be okay. Whether that was true or not really didn't matter. They might sit here and say, oh no, absolutely, we had space and room for you, which, probably in many instances was the case, but that wasn't my takeaway as a tiny human. And that's the part that matters, because it's about how we internalize what's going on that starts to set the tone, the framework, the foundation for what's to come. And so I was this needless little girl who turned into a needless adult. I would exist in all of my relationships, constantly pretending like I was fine and unaffected and unbothered. I presented like the persona was the cool girl and was like down for whatever and sure, no problem. And you do this thing that's totally boundaryless. I pretend like I'm unbothered by it. And I think the reason why I was like, ooh, I wonder which story you're talking about is that there was a story when I was in my like mid-late 20s. I was dating someone whose ex came back into the picture wanting to be back with him. And he was trying to decide whether or not he was going to go back into the relationship with her or stay in the relationship with me. And bam, right away, I'm like, oh, I totally understand. This must be such a hard decision for you. I know there's layers to it, right? It's like, and I moved right into this space of disconnecting from my emotional experience, having boundaries, not being okay with what was going on. And I was having a conversation with our mutual friend, Mark, at the time. And it all kind of clicked in for me, where I saw that I had still been in this role that I had taken on so long ago in childhood of the unaffected, unbothered, I'm totally fine, everything is okay, position. And that had been ruling my life and relationships. And I finally had the courage, and that came after, being able to see this part and, connecting to how much it had ruled my life. Finally was able to say, I am affected and I am bothered and this doesn't feel respectful and I'm going to remove myself from the situation. And I did. And, this wasn't an empowerment moment where I mic dropped after I said the thing, right? This was like, I'm in the bathroom crying for a couple of months and this was a really hard thing. But it was a big, big, big opening. And that happened after I had been in grad school. I had been, I had been a therapist for years at that time. But, I got into this work. My unevolved motivation was, I don't want to end up like my parents. It was like, I don't want to go through what they went through. And I wanted to have an education around relationships that was supportive for long-lasting, healthy dynamics. And I had never seen that. And as I went through more and more of my education and also just feet on the ground being a therapist, I started to realize more and more that, therapists, whether we know it or not, we come into this work because we're trying to resolve something that's unresolved in our lives. And for a long time, really for years, well, decades of my life, but even years into being a therapist too, it's like I had to keep coming into contact with my pain. When I first started grad school, it's like, I'm unaffected. My parents are great friends and we do holidays together and, all the things, and the divorce didn't affect me. It's like I was so afraid of not being okay. I was so afraid. I didn't know how to be with my emotions because I had trained myself to not be with them for so long. And, I didn't have a system around me that actually had the space to truly be with my true, authentic emotions. So yeah, there's obviously so many stories and, a lot of layers to it, but that was a catalyst for getting into this work.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And so many interesting pieces there. I mean, what's fascinating to me is and I think this is actually a really important thing to highlight, which is, we have these perceptions of our therapists or our doctors or our psychologists or our psychiatrists, right? That like, in order to treat us, they need to have all of their shit figured out. It is such a funny misnomer because, if you look at the best coaches in the world, these are people who maybe never professionally played in the NBA, but are so good at understanding the mechanics of a shot, right? Or a soccer coach who can see the field in a way that a really good player only sees their position. And so I love that you are sharing, and that's part of why I love what we're doing, because I think we are removing some of what I have trouble with in therapy, which is the hierarchy that sometimes can feel like it exists. And instead really humanizing this process, which is we are all going through our own shit and we all arrive to it at different times.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. And what I think about therapists in particular is that we can only go as far with clients as we go with ourselves. You'll come up against that time and time again. I remember when I was a younger, newer therapist, it's like, it's not that I couldn't be supportive and helpful, and lead a person to a particular place. I could, but then I would bump up against where the limitation was. And I think that's why it's so important for especially therapists to continue resolving that which is unresolved, because the more that we do resolve, the more that we're able to offer and be of service to our clients. And that, I think, is a bit different than the coaches. And I think you're spot on with other things where it's like, oh, I can understand this in theory and I can communicate it, or I see this very differently than my skill set might allow for. But I think when it comes to therapy, what we'll see time and time again is we can only lead people as far as we have really gone ourselves. And that's what I rubbed up against. I needed to start feeling, I needed to actually witness my pain and grieve properly in order to make space to be able to guide and allow people to go there too. And yeah, that's an important an important piece. And I think I remember long ago a client, it's very easy for people to hold you on a pedestal. They read your work, or, maybe people have read my book now at this point, and then there's an expectation of who you are and how you're going to show up. And the moment you don't meet that, right, then there's this disappointment, this letdown. So there's like that element of it on one side. But also, like you're getting at, is the human side where, and I actually do try to do this. It's like, I share when I get into conflict and all these parts, and it's like, oh no, I don't move through this perfectly all the time, right? It's like, I joke that I have this point prover part, and it's like, oh, she could get going, don't worry about it. Like, she still exists and she's still there, and my need to be right can absolutely get activated. And am I much better at the things than I once was? 100%. Am I still a human who raises her voice sometimes? Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the piece. I remember a client once saying, like, do you ever get upset? And I was like blown away by the question. I was like, oh my God, did you see me yesterday? It's like, yeah, of course, right? It's like, it's like there's this idea though, right, that we have it all figured out. Nothing, we stay grounded, nothing can get to us. We have like resolved everything in our lives. And although I would say our work is to continue on this path of resolution, the reality of it is that we are human beings too, who have complications and layers, and we're going through different stages of life right alongside of everyone else too.
Yeah, I mean, I love you sharing that, and I think that's a big part of what I want people to take away and see is that we're all on this journey. It doesn't matter what position we're in. You have this recognition. I mean, it's really interesting that you are drawn to go to school to become a therapist, right? Despite not really resolving a lot of this stuff, but there was something in you. And I love what you said. You said, so many people go into this work because they have unresolved pain in their lives, right? And even for myself, I feel that in the work that I do. And I do think what's really interesting, and this might be a little uncouth to say, but I think this is changing, but there used to be a stigma that therapists were crazy, okay? People used to say that, which was kind of a weird thing to say. Had you heard that before?
Yeah, I mean, I think to a degree, it's like that like we have all this shit that we have to resolve. And I think it is a comment that has a limitation to it though, right? It's like, yeah, because we're human, we all have shit that needs to be resolved, but there are plenty of therapists who are working in the world in a really embodied way. And
totally,
I know many of them. And do I think that there are any clinicians out there who are so unresolved that, they're not actually being supportive? Like, sure, I imagine so, somewhere out in the world, yes, right? But it's, I think when there's probably more people who are doing their work to make sure that they can be the right type of support for others. And listen, your clients it'll speak. People don't stick with you if you're not grounded enough. It's like people don't stick. It's like you will find that out very quickly based on whether clients stick around or not,
What about the other direction?
It's tough on clients. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm realizing there's a bit of a delay here, so I don't mean to cut you off. What I'm asking is, okay, fine. So a therapist loses clients. They're like, oh, maybe there's something I need to look into here. What about the other way around? If I'm a person who's going into therapy and maybe I've been a little hesitant to go into therapy and maybe I'm worried that I'm not going to find a good therapist, how do I know? Like, how do I know whether this person is good for me, aligned, embodied?
If you're attuned, if you're paying attention, part of this requires you to, in some ways, be able to trust yourself, to decipher and to know what it is that you feel. It's not supposed to feel awkward. It's not supposed to feel unsafe. It's not supposed to feel, uncomfortable, right? It's like a good therapist is going to be able to join with you, connect with you, like that there's going to be some level of comfort that's there. You feel seen, heard, and understood by them. You feel safe with them. Obviously, it takes some time. I'm not saying that you will know all of those things right off the bat, but a lot of times people will tell you that, it's like you have a conversation with a person, you're like, yeah, I feel good about this. It's like, yeah, that's it, right? Like that's the thing,
Yeah.
right? It's like, oh, I can feel just the way that you speak to me, right? It's like, oh yeah, that's the thing. And so I do believe that therapy is the intersection of the art form and the science of it. And I think that a lot of clinicians have the science part down, but that the art form is what really makes the difference between, some clinicians versus other clinicians. And yeah, that's a shopping around thing. I think sometimes we get referrals from people we trust, that type of thing. But even then, it doesn't mean that it's always a fit. But I think that this is a practice of, do I feel comfortable here? And comfortable does not mean that your therapist isn't going to challenge you, isn't going to ask you things that you're like, or like point something out about you that is hard for you to see. That's our job, right? It's not that it's like a walk in the park every time you're in therapy, or that you're going to have these big aha moments every single time you sit down on their sofa or across the screen from a person. It's like, again, that's the, what is it that I need my therapy to be? Oh, I need it to be these big ahas, these big light bulb moments every single time I connect with my therapist. Like those are the quickest ways to be disappointed and let down. And so, yeah, I think, again, that sensation within yourself, the intuitive part, connecting to that. But at the minimum, I feel connected to you. I feel like you see me, hear me, understand me, you get me, you kind of speak my language. I feel safe with you and I trust you.
Love that. I love that. So you become a therapist, okay? You start to identify, oh shit, you know what? What's really holding me back is like my own stuff that is unresolved. And fast forward, you now have carved out this real lane for yourself in dealing with family of origin, origin wounds. When do you start to pick up on this? Okay, so you pick up on it in yourself, but when do you start going, wait a minute, like there is this thing I'm seeing over and over and over again, not only in me, but in all of my clients. And when does it start to take shape for you?
Yeah, listen, when I was in grad school, I was intuitively drawn to models that were focused on understanding of our family of origin and like seeing the intergenerational patterns and like we're focused on, as marriage and family therapists, we are focused on the systems we grew up in. And, there's a focus on contextual therapy, for example, where it's like, oh, right, there's context here. I am not just this individual plopped in the middle of the world dealing with all this set of circumstances, right? It's like, I'm a part of a system and all those other people are part of multiple systems as well. And I was always drawn to that. That always made a lot of sense to me. So it's funny. It's like, yes, I had irresolution in my life, but intuitively, I was so bought in, but I wasn't bought in for myself yet. It's like I was bought in theory. I was like, yeah, this makes sense. I get it. But I wasn't quite ready to go there for myself until a few years later. And that's the part where you're like, I can still be a good enough therapist because I'm like, clinically, I get it. I see it. I can have you answer these questions. I can point this thing out to you, but I'm going to be invulnerable myself and I'm not going to go there for my own work. And that's, I had to grow up, it was like, boom. And that's where patterns, I say the unwanted patterns in our lives, they're going to be tied to unresolved pain from our past. That's essentially the premise of, the origins of you, right? It's like these unwanted patterns that we keep coming into contact with are the quote that I've been saying lately is patterns are pain's way of getting your attention. And so when we can start to tune into these patterns and like turn towards the pain, that's when we can start to work with it. And pain is not out to get us. Pain is not out to destroy us, but it is something that wants our attention, that needs our witnessing, where we really see and connect to it and honor that it exists, so that we can come into contact with our grief, right? It's like we are not allowed to just move on. We try to do that because a lot of times pain happens when we're kiddos, or it happens when we're teenagers, or it happens in our 20s, where we're like, I don't know how to witness, I don't know how to grieve, so I'm just going to muscle my way through it. That's what we do. We survive. But then there's a point where like, oh shoot, I can't just survive anymore. I actually need to honor and acknowledge this pain so it doesn't have to have such a strong grip on me anymore. And that's the beauty of pain. Pain's like, listen, I'm not out here to get you. I can loosen my grip on you as long as you acknowledge me and don't just try to get on with life, because listen, buddy, I can't let you just abandon me too, right? Because maybe the adults didn't see it, or other people didn't see it, or, it's like pain is like, hey, you can't participate in this too like everyone else, right? I need you to turn back around to me. And so that was, I had to do that work in order to be able to invite others to do that as well.
You talk about the wounds in your book, the 5 categories, right? Worthiness, prioritization, belonging, safety, trust. And I want to get to how you came up with these and ultimately how people can start to identify, where they belong. But before we get to that, how do people even start to feel into, hey, you know what? I might be struggling with an unresolved origin wound. Like I might have something here because, and you say this, everybody has them. Are these things that have to consciously be addressed, or do some people just throughout life figure out how to move through them?
I think one of the great access points is recognizing where in our lives we become most reactive, where we might blow things out of proportion, where there are patterns that we keep finding ourselves in that we're just annoyed, frustrated by, the places where we can give advice to all the people around us, but we can't take it ourselves, right? Like there's a number of places where these are pretty good indicators that we have a wound for sabotaging things, right? It's like, okay, let me pay a little bit of attention here. And because underneath that reactivity, underneath those patterns, right, is going to be something that guides us back to one of the following wounds, or maybe multiples of them, right? It's like, to notice where you become most reactive and what's internalized in that moment, right? Like, you don't care about me. You don't prioritize me. I'm just an outsider here. I don't trust you. I don't feel safe. I don't feel seen. I don't feel heard. I don't feel understood. I don't feel deserving of your time, energy, attention, whatever, right? It's like to just notice where it goes when you are reactive and what the story is that you tell, right? The same thing in like the ways that we contribute and participate in the patterns that we're frustrated by. It's like, yeah, there's an internalized story and dialogue that happens in that space that's going to direct us. One of my favorite questions, and Aaron, I know you've heard this before, is when a therapist once asked me, like, what did you need the most as a child and not get? And that question just stopped me in my tracks. And I'd never had it posed that way before. And it was like, oh no, like all my needs are met. It's like, oh my God, it was great. It was fine. Right? It's like, it's so easy to go to that place. Like, no, my parents, they provided, I had shelter, all the stuff. And then you're like, oh no, what I needed most was like space and clarity to know that it was okay for me to not be okay. I needed to know. It was like, that wasn't something that was clear to me. Right? I needed to know that there was room for me to be affected, and that in being affected, that the adults would be able to handle it. And they couldn't. They really struggled at times with that. And that's why I went to the place that I did. But it's like, oh, that's what I crave, is like authentic expression, right? And knowing that at that stage, it was so important for the adults to be able to contain that, not my responsibility as a child, right? Now as an adult, different story. But I think it's like those types of questions that can sometimes lead us to that, where it's like people are like, oh, I don't know where to start, or I don't think I have one. Or, it's like, people say, is it possible that you don't have an origin wound? And when I say origin wound, I just mean the first time. So a lot of times people get stuck in the really early years of life. You're like, well, nothing bad happened at 4, 5, 6, right? It's like, that's something that where I can see people getting stuck a little bit. It's like, no, it could be teenage years. It could be, something that happened years ago. The first time something significant happens in your life that sets you on a trajectory, right, away from yourself. Whenever that is, that's your origin story. And we know that it's not always parents. We know that's not always the adults. We know that there are other things that, influence us, from teachers to coaches to media to religion, to. But I like to take the path and the lens of really understanding the family systems we grew up in. And so, yeah, if you're like, I don't have an origin wound, or my partner doesn't think that they have an origin wound, it's like, you're not quite ready to connect to what the wound is.
Well, I literally, as you're saying this, I'm thinking about my partner who had the most, and her brother will tell you to your blue in the face, the most phenomenal childhood. And I come to the relationship with a lot of shit, and I'm constantly working through my stuff. And I think it can be hard sometimes as her partner to be like, why don't you have more shit? There's almost like it's not a resentment necessarily, and maybe at times it can be, but it's almost like a why, like there's gotta be something there. And I think for her, and what's really interesting about you saying, like, it's there, like there is something there for all of us. I think for her, what's really challenging is to have to look back on what she considers to be a perfect childhood and have to relook at it with any sort of tainted lens. And so I'm curious, as you hear that, both from my perspective as the partner who might feel like, why the fuck are you not, why was your childhood so perfect, and maybe being a little resentful, and from her end, maybe not wanting to look even deep enough. What do you say to people who are in that sort of partnership? Because I can't imagine I'm the only one.
You're not the only one. It's a great question. And what I say is, you will never partner with someone with different levels of irresolution. Take it in for a second. When you come together, right, it's not that your story is going to be the same. It's that there's a reason your puzzle pieces fit, because your levels of irresolution are similar enough. You're not together if one person is way more resolved and the other one is not. So, okay, she has a much more attractive looking history of, okay, parents did this and it wasn't that, and it's not compared to anything that you went through. But the fact that she's partnered with you, there's something there, right? Like, is her irresolution that her worthiness comes from being able to save you or fix you or, find answers for you to be okay? Does her resolution come from, being good enough that that she supports in helping heal you? It's like, I don't know what the story is, I'm just throwing things out, but it's like to look at, okay, no, you're not just the fucked up one, right? Like, you are both in similar spaces of irresolution where that irresolution dances together. Right. And you might even know, in thinking about that, hearing that, like, you might even be able to notice, like, oh yeah, what is the irresolution that comes together here? Like, why would there be a part of her that's choosing the me who has all these shiny, messy things? Like, what about that draws her in, and what's that tied to? Then the second part of the question is, there are some people who will protect their families. There's an idealization of the childhood, the experience. And it can be something, it's like, it's not to say that everybody has the worst case scenario. There's plenty of parents who do a great job, right? It's like, of course people can have, people are like, isn't it possible that I could have had like a good childhood? It's like, absolutely.
Right.
And also, it was imperfect and it was flawed. And there still is stuff there because we don't exist in vacuums. And that's the part where it's like, okay, we really need to move away from, okay, I have to protect them at all costs. And I would get curious, like, what does it serve to need to protect that story so much? And what is that blocking me from actually accessing and connecting to?
Yeah, that's really good. I love the invitation, right? I love the way you frame things as an invitation to look deeper. I think one of the interesting things about an origin wound to me is how you resolve something like that. And obviously, it's an ongoing work that is done in all of our lives. You said it yourself. There are days where that wound comes out a little more than others for you. How do you start to figure out what category you fall into in terms of your wound? And then what do you start to do about it?
So an easy place to start is that I have a free quiz that people can take if they really want to help them identify what their primary origin wound is. But beyond that, right, it's like, yeah, the steps are we have to connect to, identify, name what the wounds are. And listen, I think my book is a very good resource to help people connect to that and see, like, yeah, maybe I do have a worthiness wound. Yeah, like maybe I do have a prioritization wound. Like truly where you get the most upset in your life is where it's like it points you to it, right? So like where you get most reactive in life is going to point you to the pain that wants your attention. And so that's the invitation. And we've got a book, we've got a quiz, we've got the things to help you be able to connect to what it is if you want language for it. But you also don't have to have language for it, or you use your own language. Explain it the way that it feels for you inside your own body, right? It's like, that's okay as well. But from there, I believe that witnessing is just one of those things that is required for healing. And that's why it's the second step in the origin healing practice, is that we must witness the pain. And I think there's like a two-stop shop with this. One is witnessing it for ourselves, because I think we've, generally speaking, have done a really good job of moving away from that. And it's been interesting because we're doing the book club right now, and one of the things that's been highlighted is that there are many ways in which we distract ourselves away from the pain. And it can happen from people who don't know where their wounds are, or for people who know exactly where their pain is. But we can stay in the high level story, or we can stay in the anger, or we can stay in the facts. And those are the things that also disconnect us from connecting to the pain. Or we make up the explanations or the rationalizations, or we're like, well, they did the best that they could with what they had, or it was a really nice childhood, or I would feel so selfish complaining when they gave me everything that they could. It's like, there's so many things that we engage in to move us away from witnessing the pain that wants to be honored. And so this stop is like put a period at the end of the sentence. Don't go anywhere else with it. Stop moving away from connecting to your pain. Let it just exist. We don't need to protect everybody else while we do this. You can't protect the people in your life simultaneously while you are honoring your pain. Period. Mic drop. I said it here first, okay? It's like you can't do that. You can't do that. You have to connect with you and only you in order to witness it, in order to feel it, in order to see it. That has to happen. And I am a big believer that if it's relationships that contribute to the pain, then relationships ought to be a part of the healing as well. Good news is we don't need the person who put the pain there in the first place to be that person. It can be a loving partner. It can be a great trusted therapist. It can be a dear friend, or it can be even a stranger in the right setting that can see and connect to your story, right? But we have to have the witnessing component of this go down. Then witnessing brings us to our grief. When we exist in it authentically, witnessing will bring us to the authentic expression of our emotion, whatever that might be, however that might look, but it will invite us into that space. Grief has to happen. We have to release some of it. Grief lets us move. We cannot be grief phobic in this space. We must connect to it and allow it to move the stuff that's there. Grieving with witnessing is what creates more of the space between stimulus and response. We know that quote attributed to Viktor Frankl, between stimulus and response, there is a space. Okay, friends, we want to pull that space. We want to exaggerate that space. We want that space to be as big as possible. And the more we understand ourselves, the more we see ourselves, the more we understand our origin stories, the more we understand the origin stories of the people we love, right? That gives us a greater opportunity to pivot and choose something or say something, engage in something differently than we do before, with our expansion and healing goals in mind, instead of being driven by our pain and our wounding.
Whew. I can't believe people are going to get to hear this for free. This doesn't even feel fair. That's so much good, juicy stuff. Holy shit. You keep mentioning this idea of engaging in the pain. And it highlights for me something I have been talking a lot about with friends, with colleagues, with peers, which is that our generation is so good at intellectualizing and rationalizing. And we live in a time and place and world where there's a lot of language around trauma and pain and family systems and wounding, right? And so there's a bit of a almost currency that we exchange in when we meet people. Oh, how evolved are you? How much can you kind of, opine on why you are the way you are? And what I love about what you're saying is that is only going to take you so far. And what our generation, I feel, is stuck on is the actual internalizing, the feeling. And I will never forget sitting in therapy one day. This really changed this was such a moment for me. I was sitting in therapy one day and my therapist asked me a question and I started looking up, and she said, you do that a lot. You look up. And I was like, oh yeah? And she's like, you know what you're doing when you look up, right? And I was like, no. And she was like, you're thinking, and you need to be feeling. And that really, a light bulb went off for me, which was like, holy shit, I have spent so many years in therapy avoiding the pain because I'm really good with my words and I'm kind of charming and I seem like I know a lot about my history, but it's all in an effort to hide and run from actually sitting with the feelings, which are so fucking hard to sit with. And so I love what you just invited people to reflect on, because you can you can rationalize and intellectualize all day, and it will not do shit for you. So I really appreciate that. You also said something that I want to ask about, which is you said, you do not need to heal this wound with the wounder, effectively. And I think that oftentimes is what can be scary about the process of healing. Oh shit, am I going to have to go back and confront my mom or, confront this random family friend or whatever it is? How do you close these books, if you will, settle up the accounting without the other person?
There's an acceptance that happens with the people, that we continue to try to enlist in the process. I think a lot of people go to the source first, if the source is still here. And they'll try to package the story or what they want that person to understand or hear in a particular way. I say it this way. I explain it that way. Maybe I write you a letter about it. Maybe I say it to you really kindly. Maybe I scream it at you one day. Like, it's like we try all of these different ways to get that message across, which on the other side is the desire to be seen, heard, understood, validated, connected to, just like having the story finally be honored. And what I see, probably most of the time is that there's a limitation there from that person, whether that's it's too shameful, it's too confronting, they're filled with too much guilt, embarrassment, whatever it is. They have to defend themselves. They have to protect themselves more than they can honor what it is that you're saying. And we'll jump on the merry-go-round over and over and over again. I think that there comes a point when hopefulness is our suffering. There comes a point where when we keep negotiating and bargaining with ourselves or trying and trying and trying, or we've said the only way for me to feel better is once you do X, Y, Z, we have held ourselves hostage and we have created an environment where we will continue to suffer. And there's a big sense of relief and a big breath that's taken when we can finally get to this place where we accept what the limitations are, what the constraints are. We get to decide, for some people that might mean that they can't have that person in their lives at all. I think that's far and fewer between. I don't think that that's the, final resting place for most people. I think most people still want to have that person in their lives in some capacity, but it's figuring out what that looks like. But I always say, stop going to the place where you can't be seen and heard, right? Like, go to the place where you can be heard and understood. And whether that is you with you or somebody else in your life who is a phenomenal human for you to see and hear and understand and validate you, like, that becomes part of the pivot to move away from the suffering merry-go-round, to jump off and to connect to where validation and observation and witnessing can exist. We have to let the thought, the fantasy die that the person, whoever the person is going to do that thing that you crave and want them to do when they have repeatedly shown you that they're not going to. Right? Like, that has to die. But we outsource so much. I will only heal once they accept it. I will only feel once they validate it. And then you put all of the power in everybody else's hands and you move yourself into a helpless position where you will rest until you make a switch.
Yeah, that is, I think that's hard to hear for people. I think that's it's tough to swallow a lot of these pills. And I think it's tough because they involve oftentimes people that are so intimately connected to us or were so intimately connected to us. One thing I love that you have said is that time does not heal all wounds. That really stuck with me because I think a lot of times when we're suffering, people like to say to us, time heals everything. And I remember going through, my sort of big relationship moment where I had this kind of huge breakup. And I remember getting to the other side of it and going, time heals all wounds if you do the work. And I'd love you to speak a little bit to how people who are maybe in a space where there's healing to be done and have maybe thought, this will resolve itself at some point, but there is that nagging voice in the back of their head. They can download your free worksheet. They can read the book Origins of You, which is incredible and honestly is like, almost like building the foundation of a house before you put the furniture in. I think it's that important. People should be reading that and doing that kind of work. Outside of those things, where does somebody today start this work?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me address the time piece because it's like that's right. Time alone will not heal all wounds. What time does is just allow you to avoid better. Right? Like that's what happens is like time goes by. And if you're not doing anything else in that space, right? If you're not being intentional, then you just go on a journey of avoidance. Right? And that's where like the pain will resurface and it will grab at you in other ways. And so, yeah, it's like you can move the pain in the back corner. You can put a lid on it. You can tie a bow around it. It's like, sure, time will do that for you, but it still exists and it's coming for you. I promise you that it is coming for you. It will look for, and I don't mean that in the cynical, like I got you kind of way, but it's like it comes for you through patterns. And those patterns will frustrate and irritate the heck out of you until you either look at them or you die. And I don't mean that to be morbid or like, but it's the truth, right? Like your life will either kind of keep going on the way that it is and you're going to be pissed and you're going to hate it and you're going to blame everybody else and you're going to be in the victim position forever, or you're going to address it. Who knew I was coming for people today, Aaron?
Coming for people.
I'm coming.
I love it. I love it. You know why I love it? Because I think people, we spend our lives a little bit babying ourselves at times. And that's our coping mechanism and our soothing mechanism. And we love to surround ourselves with people who say, yeah, fuck them, or, don't listen to them, or, whatever it is. And some of that is great. Some of that building each other up is great and so necessary. And I have friends and we get together and we just light each other up. And those same friends are the ones who keep it 100% fucking real with me. And so when I am not looking at my own shit or I am dropping the ball, people like you or Mark or, my friends who are not even practitioners of this work will hold me accountable, because you get to a point when you see the other side. And look, this is not me on some, higher than thou soapbox. I got tons of shit I am still working out, but I have gotten to a place where it gives me the ick to surround myself with people who are not willing to call me on my shit, because I'm like, how are you letting me get away with that? Like that, this feels really weird and uncomfortable. And so, yeah, come for them, because it's a gift. It is a huge gift. Okay, before we go and we talk about where people can find you and the amazing book that you've written, how they can find that, every week we have somebody from our Instagram audience submit a question. And I'm going to play you that question. It's a voicemail. It's kind of like old school. Let's see how we do here.
Hi, Vienna. I'm such a big fan of your work. I'm currently halfway through your book and I just love it. My question for you is, I feel like I'm becoming aware of so many of my wounds. Like every page that I read in your book, I'm like, check, check, check. And it's a little overwhelming. I've done so much healing work on myself already, and it seems I still have so far to go. So my question is, like, when are we healed enough to have healthy relationships? Sometimes I worry that I'm not healed enough around my worthiness or trust wounds in order to meet an available romantic partner. That I have to be perfectly healed before that's possible for me. And then that's just really overwhelming. So how do I have self-compassion for myself as more is being revealed around my wounds?
How about that?
I love this. That's great. Thank you for the question and for the sweet comments at the beginning there. So, okay. This is a forever practice. It never ends. and it's a recommitment to this work over and over and over again. Life and its stages will bring us back into contact with our pain and our wounds till the end of time, right? It's like it just will do that. And, I think that if I could try to answer that question, when are we healed enough to have healthy relationships? I think it's when we have enough awareness around the pain and around our patterns, where we have the opportunities in the space that I was talking about before to choose differently more than we choose the old pattern. So like if I can notice, oh, normally I would do this thing, point, prove, need to be right. So like that part of me probably shows up, I don't know, 5 to 10% of the time in my life. But the rest of the time I can put that pattern down. It's like I don't have to engage in that behavior. I don't get caught up in it. And so, I would say that as long as you have this awareness, it's interesting because this person had mentioned choosing an available partner. So there's a detail there. And they also mentioned a worthiness wound, which I actually just did a post on this today, that the problem is not about being attracted to unavailable people. It's about the pursuit of unavailable people and the curiosity of, do I pursue someone who's unavailable because it is driven by, for example, a worthiness wound, right? Where it's like, if I can get this person to become available, then I am good enough. And so I think in just hearing that comment from this person, is my pain motivating and generating my behaviors and words, or is more of my healing able to generate that, right? And so yeah, it can feel overwhelming. It is overwhelming. There's so much there. There's complexity and richness to our stories. And I think to have that compassion, like you said, is so important. I am human. I've got all of these flaws and parts that are messy and interesting that I can get curious about. I'm going to keep meeting parts of myself that I have yet to meet. That is every single one of us. And meet that part with the self-love, right? That's the intersection of compassion and grace for the self, as well as ownership, responsibility, accountability for the ways in which we are contributing and participating in the letdown, the dysfunction of these patterns in our relationships, right? And so to enter into that gap a little bit differently. And I think the awareness, like, I imagine that you're actually probably already in a space where you can, do a lot of this. So thank you for that question.
Beautiful, beautiful answer. You are amazing. I continue to feel lucky to get to watch you and your journey evolve as a therapist, a practitioner, a writer, a friend, a mother. It's really been beautiful, and I am so grateful for this opportunity to capture this moment in your life, having just published your first book, which is incredible. Where do people find you? Where can people get the book?
Yeah, the book is everywhere that books are sold. The Origins of You, How Breaking Family Patterns Can Liberate the Way We Live and Love. And you can find me on Instagram, Mindful MFT, as in Marriage Family Therapy. Link in bio has most of my stuff, ViennaPharaon.com, NewYorkCouplesCounseling.com. And if you want to work with me and are in a relationship, my husband and I are doing a couples weekend workshop June 3rd and 4th in New York City, but also a virtual option. So people should definitely check that out as well.
Connor is amazing. Shout out to Connor. Vienna, this has been a pleasure. If you're listening to this, go out and heal your origin wounds, people. This is exciting stuff. It's scary and it is super exciting, and your life will never be the same. So enjoy the book, enjoy the journey, and we will see you next week.